snow stung Cora's cheeks like shards of glass. Her father's grip on her arm was iron, dragging her toward the looming shadow of a cabin hunched against the Montana wilderness. "This is your bed now, girl," Jedediah Hale spat, shoving her forward onto the frozen ground. 17, shamed, heavy with a child not her husband's, she faced the silent, bear-like figure in the doorway. Who was this mountain man? And what happened when that door closed behind her forever? The world had shrunk to the biting cold, the crunch of snow under worn boots, and the iron vice of her father's hand on her upper arm. Cora Hale stumbled, her belly a cumbersome weight throwing her off balance, but Jedediah Hale didn't slow. He hauled her upright without a glance, his jaw set like granite against the howling wind that scoured the high valley. Snowflakes, sharp as needles, lashed her exposed skin, already raw from the miles-long trek from the meager cluster of buildings they called Pine Creek. Her thin calico dress and threadbare shawl were no match for the Montana winter clawing its way down from the Bitterroot Peaks. Punishment. The word echoed in the hollow space Jedediah's love had vacated. Getting pregnant by Tommy Briggs, the charming feckless ranch hand who'd vanished faster than spring meltwater at the first hint of trouble, had been her sin. Her mother's quiet tears and whispered pleas had been silenced by Jedediah's thunderous wrath. Her shame wasn't just personal, it was a stain on the Hale name in a town where virtue was currency, especially for unmarried women. Cora had known retribution would be harsh, but nothing had prepared her for this frozen exile. They crested a rise, and there it was. Not a homestead, not even a proper ranch, just a squat, rough-hewn log cabin, smoke curling reluctantly from a stone chimney, huddled against a sheer rock face as if seeking shelter from the very sky. It looked less built and more clawed from the unforgiving earth. A single window, dark and small as a wary eye, watched their approach. A lean-to sheltered a single sturdy-looking dun horse, head down against the weather. Beyond, the mountains reared up, vast and indifferent, cloaked in snow and shadow. The sheer isolation stole Cora's breath. Pine Creek, with its judgmental stares, suddenly felt like a haven. Jedediah stopped a dozen yards from the cabin door. He didn't call out, he simply stood, gripping Cora, his gaze fixed on the dark rectangle of the entrance. Minutes stretched, filled only by the moan of the wind and the frantic hammering of Cora's heart against her ribs. The cold seeped deeper, into her bones, into the core of her fear. Then, the door opened inward, slowly, without a sound. A man filled the space. Not tall but broad, thick through the shoulders and chest like an ancient oak stump. He wore layers, a heavy wool shirt under a coat of what looked like poorly tanned elk hide, trousers tucked into scarred leather boots crusted with snow. His beard was a wild, grizzled thicket covering most of his face, streaked with gray, merging with the shaggy hair tucked under a battered felt hat. Only his eyes were truly visible, deep-set, a startlingly clear pale blue like chips of winter ice. They swept over Jedediah with a dispassionate flicker, then settled on Cora. There was no discernible reaction, no surprise, no anger, no pity, just an unnerving, all-encompassing assessment that seemed to measure her weight, her worth, and her despair in one glacial glance. Jedediah cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the stillness. "Silas Thorne." It wasn't a greeting, it was an announcement. "Brought the girl, like we agreed, Silas Thorne." The name conjured nothing but cold stone in Cora's mind. Whispers in Pine Creek spoke of a trapper, a man who lived beyond the edge of civilized concern, trading pelts twice a year and otherwise vanishing into the high country. A man spoken of with a mixture of wary respect and superstitious fear. Don't go near Thorne's Valley. The children were warned. Now he was her jailer. Silas didn't move, his gaze remained locked on Cora. She felt it like a physical pressure, peeling back her layers, seeing the terrified girl beneath the shame, the burgeoning life within her that felt like both a burden and her only fragile hope. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the snow. She forced herself to meet his eyes, a spark of defiance flaring briefly against the crushing weight of her situation. "She's your problem now," Jedediah stated flatly. giving Cora a final dismissive shove towards the cabin. She stumbled, catching herself awkwardly on her hands and knees in the deep snow, the cold instantly burning through her thin gloves. She gasped, humiliation warring with a fresh wave of terror. He didn't even look back. "Paid you fair. See she don't starve for the brat comes. After that, do what you will." He turned on his heel, his boots crunching purposefully away through the snow, back towards the trail, back towards a life that no longer had a place for Cora Hale. The silence after his departure was profound. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Cora remained on her knees in the snow, trembling violently, tears freezing on her lashes before they could fall. She couldn't bring herself to look up at the man, the mountain, who now owned her existence. The weight of her father's abandonment, the terrifying unknown of the figure looming above her, the sheer brutal hostility of the landscape. It pressed down, threatening to extinguish the last flicker of warmth inside her. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, bracing for a blow, for rough hands. Instead, she heard a low grunt, almost like rock shifting. Then, a large, calloused hand appeared in her peripheral vision, palm up, offering no help, but simply there, waiting. Slowly, trembling so hard her teeth chattered, Cora lifted her gaze. Silas Thorne stood beside her, his expression unreadable behind the beard, those ice-blue eyes fixed not on her face but on her mittened hand resting on the snow. He hadn't offered to pull her up, he'd simply presented his own hand, an invitation she didn't understand. Was it a test? Mockery? Swallowing a sob, Cora ignored the offered hand. She pushed herself up, clumsy and slow, her body aching with cold and exhaustion and the awkwardness of her pregnancy. She stood, swaying slightly, brushing snow from her skirt with numb fingers, avoiding his gaze. She focused on the open cabin door behind him, a rectangle of deeper shadow promising, if not warmth, then at least shelter from the biting wind. Silas lowered his hand. He didn't speak. He simply turned and walked back towards the cabin, his movements surprisingly quiet for a man of his bulk. He didn't hold the door for her, but he left it open, an unspoken command, or perhaps merely indifference. Gathering the tattered shreds of her courage, Cora followed. The smell hit her first as she crossed the threshold. Wood smoke, cured leather, dried herbs, and something earthier, wilder, like damp fir and pine resin. It was dim inside, the only light coming from the low fire crackling in the stone hearth opposite the door, and the weak daylight filtering through the small, greased paper window. The air was thick, warm compared to outside, but carrying a chill draft from unseen cracks. The cabin was one room, rough plank floor, log walls darkened by smoke. To her left, a narrow cot piled with furs. To her right, a sturdy table with a single stool, shelves holding an assortment of tin plates, cups, burlap sacks and tools, knives, an axe head, coils of rope. A flintlock rifle leaned against the wall near the door, within easy reach. Hides, rabbit, beaver, what looked like a wolf pelt, were stretched and pegged to the walls. The air hummed with a profound, watchful silence. Silas moved to the hearth, his back to her. He picked up a cast-iron pot hanging from a hook and stirred its contents with a long-handled spoon. The smell of simmering beans and something gamey filled the small space. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her presence beyond the initial silent acceptance of her entry. Cora stood just inside the door, unsure where to go, what to do. The heat from the fire began to seep into her frozen limbs, causing an almost painful prickling sensation. Her wet skirt clung to her legs. She hugged her arms around herself, the enormity of her situation crashing over her anew. This was her life now, this silent wild man, this cramped smoky hut, this endless wilderness. Her hand instinctively rested on the curve of her belly, a silent plea to the tiny life within. "What have I brought you to?" Minutes stretched. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the scrape of Silas's spoon in the pot, and the relentless wind whistling around the eaves. Cora's legs began to ache. She scanned the room again, desperately seeking a corner, a stool, anything that wasn't the cold floor or the intimidating proximity of the cot. Her gaze snagged on something tucked into the shadows near the head of the cot, partially obscured by a hanging deerskin. It was a small, framed daguerreotype, propped on a rough shelf. The image was faded, the details hard to make out in the gloom, but it clearly showed a woman, dark-haired, gentle-faced, holding a swaddled infant, a stark, jarring note of tenderness in this harsh, masculine domain. Before she could process this unexpected glimpse into the mountain man's past, Silas turned. He held a chipped enamel bowl filled with steaming stew. He didn't look at her, he simply placed the bowl on the edge of the rough-hewn table, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. Then, without a word, he picked up a heavy bearskin from a pile near the hearth. He walked towards her, his steps measured. Cora froze, pressing back against the rough wood of the door, fear surging anew. Was this it? Some crude demand? But Silas stopped a few feet away. He didn't look at her face. His gaze was fixed somewhere near her damp hemline. With a movement that was neither rough nor gentle, simply functional, he thrust the heavy fur towards her. "Floor's cold," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like stones grinding together. It was the first sound he'd made since her father left, and it startled her almost as much as his proximity. He didn't elaborate, he just held out the bearskin, his pale eyes finally lifting to meet hers. They held no warmth, no cruelty, just a flat, weary acceptance, and something else, a flicker of something ancient and guarded, that sent a different kind of chill down Cora's spine. Who was the woman in the picture? And why did the act of offering a skin for the floor feel like the first crack in a fortress wall? The bearskin was heavy, smelling of wood smoke and the deep musky wildness that clung to Silas Thorne. Cora dragged it towards the far wall, putting as much space as possible between herself and the mountain man tending the fire. The rough-hewn planks bit through her thin dress, even with the fur beneath her. She huddled into it, pulling the thick pelt up to her chin, trying to absorb its meager warmth and disappear into its shadows. Silas hadn't spoken again. He'd eaten his stew standing by the hearth, his back a solid, unreadable wall. Then, he'd moved with quiet efficiency, banking the fire, checking the heavy bar across the door, retrieving a whetstone and a long, wicked-looking Bowie knife from a shelf. The rhythmic shick-shick of steel on stone became the cabin's heartbeat, unnerving and constant in the profound quiet. Cora watched him through half-closed lids, exhaustion warring with terror. The firelight danced on the blade, glinting off his ice-blue eyes when they occasionally flickered towards the door or window, ever vigilant. The daguerreotype near the cot drew her gaze repeatedly. Who was the woman, the child? Had Silas Thorne once known something other than this stark solitude? The thought was unsettling, a crack in the image of the unfeeling brute her father had delivered her to. It hinted at a past loss, perhaps a grief as deep and cold as the mountains outside. Did that make him more dangerous, or something else? Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by her father's stony face, Tommy Briggs's laughing eyes turning dismissive, and the suffocating shame of Pine Creek's whispers. Harlot, ruined, burdened, she woke gasping, the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness pressing in, the mournful cry of a coyote, the groan of timber settling, the relentless wind sawing at the eaves. Each time Silas was still there, sometimes sharpening the knife, sometimes just sitting on his cot, staring into the embers, a silhouette carved from shadow and sorrow. He never looked at her. Dawn bled gray and weak through the greased paper window. Silas was already moving, pulling on his heavy coat and hat. He paused at the door, his hand on the heavy bar, his gaze swept the room, lingering for the briefest moment on Cora, curled small in her bearskin nest. "Water bucket," he grunted, the word rough as unplaned wood. He nodded towards a large wooden pail near the hearth. "Springs behind the lean-to. Ice is thin. Mind your step." Then he was gone, the door closing with a soft but final thud, leaving her alone in the sudden echoing silence. The weight of his absence was almost as heavy as his presence. Cora pushed herself up, her body stiff and aching. The baby shifted restlessly within her, a reminder of the life tethered to her own precarious existence. Mind your step. A warning, or merely practical advice? Gathering her courage, she pulled the shawl tighter and picked up the heavy bucket. Stepping outside was like walking into a wall of frozen air. The landscape was breathtakingly harsh, snow-laden pines clawing at a leaden sky, jagged peaks piercing the clouds, an ocean of white broken only by the dark ribbon of a frozen creek far below. The isolation was absolute, terrifying. Pine Creek's judgment felt like a distant, almost nostalgic torment compared to this consuming wilderness. The spring bubbled from a cleft in the rock face behind the lean-to, steaming faintly in the frigid air, feeding a small, partially frozen pool. Cora broke the thin ice crust with the bucket's edge, the crack loud in the stillness. As she bent to fill it, a sharp, twisting pain seized her lower belly. It wasn't the baby kicking, it was deeper, cramping, radiating down her thighs. She gasped, dropping to her knees in the snow, clutching her swollen middle. Panic, cold and sharp as the ice shards lanced through her. No, not here, not now, not alone. Images flashed. Her mother, pale and whispering about the dangers of childbirth, the stories of women who bled out in remote shanties, babies lost before they drew breath. The shame of her pregnancy was eclipsed by the raw terror of dying in this frozen wasteland, her child dying with her, unseen and unmourned by anyone but the silent, indifferent mountains. Tears, hot this time, spilled over, freezing tracks on her cheeks. She rocked slightly, whispering desperate, wordless pleas into the biting air. Minutes stretched, each heartbeat a hammer blow of fear. Gradually, slowly, the cramping subsided, leaving her trembling and weak, kneeling in the snow beside the half-filled bucket. Exhaustion and relief washed over her, leaving a residue of profound vulnerability. She had never felt so utterly exposed, so fragile. Struggling to her feet, she finished filling the bucket, her movements slow and cautious. Hauling it back inside the cabin felt like a monumental task. She placed it near the hearth, her limbs lidden. Silas wasn't back. The cabin felt colder, emptier than before. She sank onto the bearskin, drawing her knees up, resting her forehead on them, trying to calm the frantic fluttering in her chest. The memory of Tommy Briggs surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. He'd found her by the creek behind the livery, away from prying eyes. His smile was sunshine, his touch electric against the drudgery of Pine Creek. "You're different, Cora," he'd murmured, fingers tracing her jaw. "Pretty as a mountain bluebird." Promises fell like rain, a life together, a little house, respectability once he made his stake. She'd believed him, starved for affection, for a future beyond her father's stern rules, and her mother's quiet sadness. The thrill of secrecy, the stolen kisses behind the feed sacks, the dizzying sensation of being wanted. It had felt like flying, until the sickness started, until her mother's eyes filled with dawning horror, until Tommy's smile vanished, replaced by a panicked, shifty look. "Jedediah Hale's daughter? Cora, I gotta go. Got word of work down south. Real good pay." He'd touched her cheek once more, a ghost of his former warmth. "You'll be all right." He hadn't even looked back as he rode out of town the next dawn, taking her naivety and her future with him. Her father's rage had been biblical, a firestorm of condemnation that branded her a Jezebel, a stain on his good name. Her mother's tears had been silent rivers of helpless grief. A log shifted in the hearth, sending a shower of sparks upwards, jolting Cora back to the present, back to the cold cabin, the vast emptiness, the terrifying cramp, and the silent mountain man who owned her fate. Shame curdled in her stomach, hotter than the fading pain. Her foolishness had brought her here, to the edge of the world, to the mercy of a stranger whose mercy felt as distant as the sun. The door opened, bringing a gust of frigid air and Silas. He carried 2 snowshoe hares, their bodies limp. His gaze swept the room, landing on Cora, still huddled on the floor, her face undoubtedly pale and tear-streaked. He didn't ask. He simply hung his coat and hat, then moved to the table. He began skinning the hares with swift, economical movements, the knife flashing. The silence stretched, thick with the unsaid, her fear, her pain, her history. Cora watched his hands, the practiced ease, the strength in his thick fingers. He worked with a focused intensity that excluded everything else. Yet when he finished, he didn't immediately start cooking. He walked to the hearth, poked the fire, added a small log. Then, to Cora's astonishment, He took a small blackened kettle from a hook and filled it with water from the bucket she had brought. He rummaged on a high shelf, pulling down a small leather pouch. He pinched some dried, crumbled leaves into the kettle and hung it over the fire. He said nothing. He didn't look at her, but the intent was clear. It wasn't stew. It was tea. Medicinal tea? Her mother had brewed similar for monthly cramps. The unexpectedness of it, this silent, practical response to her unspoken distress, struck Cora harder than any word of comfort could have. A lump formed in her throat. He had noticed. He hadn't ignored her distress on the floor. He had acted in his own wordless way. The simple act cracked the shell of her despair just a fraction. Curiosity, fragile but persistent, stirred within her, driven by a need to understand the enigma who offered no comfort yet provided a skin for the floor and now tea for an unseen pain. Cora pushed herself up. Her legs felt shaky, but she walked slowly towards the shelf near his cot, drawn again to the daguerreotype. The firelight caught the edge of the tarnished frame. The woman's face, though faded, held a quiet serenity. The infant was a bundle of swaddling clothes, impossibly small and vulnerable. Hesitantly, her fingers trembling, Cora reached out. She didn't pick it up, just let her fingertip lightly trace the edge of the cold frame. A connection, however tenuous, to the humanity hidden beneath Silas Thorne's gruff exterior. A floorboard creaked behind her. Cora froze, snatching her hand back as if burned. Silas stood only a few feet away. He hadn't made a sound approaching. His gaze wasn't on her face, but on the picture she had just touched. His expression was unreadable, but the air in the cabin shifted, charged with a sudden, potent tension. The pale blue eyes, usually so distant, held a flicker of something raw and fiercely protective. A glimpse of an old, deep wound laid bare. He didn't speak. He didn't move towards her. He just stood there, a silent sentinel guarding a ghost, the steam from the forgotten kettle beginning to whisper urgently into the silence. The message was clear. That is not yours to touch. The fragile understanding of moments before vanished, replaced by a chilling sense of trespass. Who were they? And what had happened to them? The questions hung heavy, unanswered, amplifying the cabin's oppressive silence. Suddenly, a sound cut through the quiet, not the wind, not an animal. A distinct, rhythmic thud, 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 hoofbeats, approaching the cabin. Fast, Silas's head snapped towards the door, his body instantly coiled like a spring. The protective shadow vanished, replaced by the alert, dangerous stance of a man expecting trouble. His hand went to the knife still lying on the table, his knuckles white, his gaze sharp and assessing, darted to Cora, then back to the door, a silent question hanging between them in the suddenly electrified air. Who was out there? Friend? Foe? Had her father changed his mind? Or had someone from Pine Creek come to finish the job of her shame? The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, stopping just outside the barred door. A fist hammered against the heavy wood, sharp and demanding. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird echoing the frantic rhythm from outside. Silas didn't move towards the door. He stood poised, a mountain ready to avalanche, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting. The only sound now was the frantic pounding, the crackle of the fire, and Cora's own ragged breath catching in her throat. The fragile peace of the isolated cabin was shattered. Danger, immediate and unknown, had arrived on their frozen doorstep. The pounding hammered against the heavy door like a frantic heartbeat against Cora's ribs. Thud, thud, thud. Each blow vibrated through the rough planks, echoing the terror freezing her limbs. Silas Thorne hadn't moved from his coiled stance near the table, the skinning knife now gripped low and ready in his fist. His ice-blue eyes were fixed on the door, narrowed to slits, every line of his body radiating a predatory stillness. The protective shadow she'd glimpsed moments ago guarding the daguerreotype was gone, replaced by the feral alertness of a cornered wolf. The forgotten kettle hissed furiously over the fire, the only sound besides the demanding knocks and Cora's own ragged breath. "Thorne, open up! Know you're in there!" The voice that shouted through the wood was young, strained and achingly familiar. It sliced through Cora's fear, replacing it with a different kind of shock. Elijah, her younger brother. Before she could react, Silas moved, not towards the door but towards her. In 2 swift strides he was beside her, his hand clamping onto her upper arm, not painfully but with undeniable force. His touch was startlingly warm through the thin fabric of her dress. He didn't speak, didn't look at her. His gaze remained locked on the door, but he pulled her bodily away from the central space, towards the deeper shadows near the cot. He shoved her gently but firmly down behind a large stack of firewood, partially covered by a stiff buffalo hide. Hide. He pressed a finger to his lips, a universal urgent command for silence, then dropped the edge of the hide, plunging her into near darkness. The world shrank to the rough grain of the wood against her cheek, the smell of dust and pine resin, and the terrifying tableau she could just glimpse through a narrow gap. Silas moved back towards the door, his tread unnervingly silent despite his bulk. He paused, hand hovering near the heavy wooden bar. "Who's askin'?" His voice was a low growl, deliberately rough, carrying through the thick timber. "Elijah Hale, Cora's brother. Open the damn door, Thorne. I know he brought her here." Elijah's voice cracked, a mixture of anger and desperation. Silas slid the bar back slowly, deliberately, the scrape of wood on wood loud in the tense silence. He pulled the door open just wide enough to fill the gap with his broad frame, blocking any view inside. The weak afternoon light silhouetted him, casting a long menacing shadow across the cabin floor. Cora, peering through her tiny aperture, saw her brother framed in the doorway. Elijah, only 15, looked older, his face pale beneath a coating of trail dust, his eyes wide and frantic. He wore a worn sheepskin coat too big for him, likely their father's cast-off, and clutched the reins of a lathered horse that snorted plumes of steam into the frigid air behind him. He looked exhausted, terrified, and utterly out of his depth. "She ain't here," Silas stated flatly, his voice devoid of inflection. "Liar," Elijah spat, trying to peer around Silas's bulk. "Pa said he brought her. Told Maine he dealt with the problem." The word problem hung in the air, a branding iron on Cora's soul, even hidden. "Maine's sick, Thorne. Real sick. Pneumonia, Doc thinks. She keeps calling for Cora." His voice broke. "Pa won't budge. Says she made her bed. But Maine, she's asking for her daughter." A wave of cold dread washed over Cora, sharper than the Montana wind. Maine, her gentle, sorrowful mother, who had wept silently when Jedediah pronounced his judgment. Sick, dying, calling for her shamed, banished daughter. The cramping fear she'd felt at the spring was nothing compared to this icy fist squeezing her heart. She pressed a hand against her mouth to stifle a whimper. Silas didn't move. "Told you, she ain't here." His tone brooked no argument. Jedediah Hale made a deal. He don't get to change it on a whim, especially not through his whelp. "She's my sister." Elijah's voice rose, trembling with impotent fury. "You can't just keep her prisoner. Let me see her. Let me talk to her." "This ain't a social call, boy." Silas shifted slightly, his hand still resting near the knife tucked into his belt. "You delivered your message. Now ride on back. Trail's getting dark." There was a finality in his words, a quiet menace that even the distraught Elijah couldn't ignore. Elijah stared up at the implacable wall of man and wood. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a despair that mirrored Cora's own. He glanced past Silas, his eyes scanning the dim interior of the cabin, lingering for a moment near the stacked wood where Cora hid. Did he sense her? Or was it just hopelessness? He took a shaky breath. "Tell her," he whispered, the wind snatching at his words. He turned abruptly, fumbling with his horse's reins, his youthful frame looking impossibly small against the vast snowy backdrop. He mounted clumsily, and spurred the weary horse back down the treacherous path without another look. Silas watched him go, a dark silhouette against the fading light, until horse and rider disappeared around the bend. Then, slowly, he pushed the door shut. The heavy thunk of the bar sliding back into place echoed like a tomb ceiling. The cabin plunged back into fire-lit gloom, the only sound the crackle of flames and the frantic hissing of the kettle. Cora stayed frozen behind the woodpile, the rough bark imprinting itself on her cheek. Her mother's face swam before her eyes, pale against a pillow, racked by coughs whispering her name. The image was sharp, pulled from a memory of her own childhood fever, her mother's cool hand on her brow, humming a soft lullaby. That gentle touch, that unconditional love, felt like a lifetime ago, buried beneath layers of shame and Jedediah's righteous wrath. Mai was sick, dying, asking for her, and she was trapped here, useless, hidden behind a buffalo hide while her brother was sent away. The rustle of the hide being lifted startled her. Silas stood there, looking down at her crouched form. His face was unreadable in the flickering light. He didn't offer a hand this time. He simply stepped back, giving her space to emerge. Cora pushed herself up, her legs trembling violently, tears she could no longer suppress streaming silently down her face. She didn't look at him. She stumbled towards the hearth, drawn to its feeble warmth, her arms wrapped protectively around her belly. The baby kicked, a frantic flutter, as if sensing her turmoil. She's really sick." Cora's voice was a raw whisper, barely audible over the fire. Silas moved to the hearth. He didn't answer immediately. He used a thick mitt to lift the screaming kettle off the hook, the steam billowing around his impassive face. He poured the hot water into a chipped mug, then rummaged in the same leather pouch as before, adding a different pinch of dried herbs. He stirred it silently, then held the mug out towards her. "Not tea for cramps this time. Something else? Something pungent and earthy." "Chamomile," he grunted. "Calms the nerves." Cora stared at the offered mug, then up at his stony face. He had lied to Elijah. He had hidden her. He hadn't softened at the news of her mother. Yet, he'd made her this. A gesture as confounding as the bearskin or the previous tea. She took the mug, the heat seeping into her icy fingers. She didn't drink. She just held it, the warmth a fragile anchor. "Jedediah Hale," Silas said, his voice low and rough, "is a man who thinks the world bends to his will, sends his boy into dangerous country, alone, near dark. For what? To ease a dying woman's mind, or ease his own conscience." He spat the words like venom into the fire. "Sickness don't care about deals or shame, but riding that trail at night, that's a death wish." He handed his son. He turned his pale eyes on her, a flicker of something harsh and knowing in their depths. "You goin' back wouldn't cure your ma. It just feed his notion he owns everything, even misery." The brutal truth of it hit Cora like a physical blow. Her father hadn't sent Elijah out of compassion for his wife or daughter. He'd sent him to assuage his own guilt, to maintain the illusion of control, heedless of the danger to his youngest son. Silas saw it clearly. He'd protected her, not out of kindness towards her perhaps, but out of a fierce, unspoken rejection of Jedediah Hale's poisonous authority. He'd also, indirectly, protected Elijah by sending him back before true dark fell. Later, as the deep velvet of night enveloped the cabin, the silence was shattered not by knocks, but by a chilling sound from the woods beyond the thin walls, the long mournful howl of a wolf. Then another, closer, and another, a chorus of primal hunger echoing through the frozen valley. Cora, lying stiffly on the bearskin, felt the blood drain from her face. The fire cast monstrous, dancing shadows on the walls. Silas, sitting sharpening his knife again, went utterly still, his head tilted, listening intently. The howls came again, closer still, converging. Without a word, Silas stood. He moved to the single window, peering out cautiously through the greased paper. He grunted, a low, dissatisfied sound. He checked the bar on the door again, then walked to the corner where his flintlock rifle leaned. He picked it up, checked the load with practiced efficiency, and propped it beside the door within easy reach. Then, he did something unexpected. He walked over to the stack of firewood near Cora. He began methodically adding logs to the fire, building it higher, brighter, until the flames roared and crackled, casting a strong, defiant circle of light that pushed against the oppressive darkness outside. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. But the message was clear. The fire was a shield. He was fortifying their small sanctuary against the unseen threat. He then dragged a heavy wooden chest from beside his cot, positioning it near the door, another barrier. Finally, he picked up the long-handled axe that usually leaned near the hearth, and placed it on the floor beside his stool, within arm's reach. The cabin, once merely shelter, now felt like a fortress under siege. Cora watched him, her fear of the wolves mingling with a dawning reluctant awe at his silent, efficient preparedness. He was a bulwark against the wilderness, against her father's cruelty, and now, against the primal teeth in the night. The howls continued, circling closer, a nerve-shredding serenade. Silas sat back down on his stool, the rifle resting across his knees, the axe at his feet. He stared into the roaring fire, his profile grim, illuminated by the flickering light. He looked less like a man, and more like an ancient spirit of the mountains, carved from stone and resolve. Hours passed. The howls eventually subsided, fading back into the vast, indifferent night. The fire burned lower. Exhaustion finally pulled Cora towards an uneasy sleep, lulled by the rhythmic sound of Silas's breathing and the dying crackle of the logs. As she drifted, her hand, resting on her swollen belly, brushed against something tucked partially under the edge of the bearskin near the wall. Something smooth and curved, not wood or stone. It felt like carved wood, deliberately shaped. Curiosity pierced her drowsiness. She carefully shifted, pulling the object slightly out from under the fur. It was a small, unfinished cradle, rough-hewn from pale pine, the curves still sharp, wood shavings clinging to its surface. It was small, simple, clearly intended for an infant. One rocker was partially carved, the other still a blocky shape. Cora's breath caught. It hadn't been there before. When had he? She stared at the cradle, then lifted her gaze toward Silas. He was still seated, but his head was turned. He was looking directly at her, his face shadowed, the firelight catching only the glint of his pale blue eyes. He'd seen her find it. He'd seen the shock, the dawning comprehension on her face. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched her, his expression utterly unreadable in the dim light. The unfinished cradle lay between them on the cold floor, a silent, profound question hanging heavy in the air. Who carved this? And for whom? The wolves were gone, but a new, deeper mystery had taken root in the fragile quiet of the cabin. The unfinished cradle lay between them like a physical presence, the rough pine cool beneath Cora's trembling fingers. Silas's gaze, locked onto hers from his stool by the dwindling fire, was a silent, impenetrable wall. He didn't move to take it. He didn't speak. He simply watched, his ice-blue eyes reflecting the low flames, unreadable as the mountain peaks at dawn. The howls of the wolves were a memory, replaced by this new, profound tension vibrating in the cabin's air. Cora slowly withdrew her hand from the small wooden form, leaving it exposed on the bearskin near the wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the deep, slow breath Silas took. Was it anger she saw in his stillness? Grief? Or merely the watchfulness of a man guarding territory she'd inadvertently trespassed? The questions screamed in her mind, louder than the wolves ever had. Who was it for? The child in the picture? A child lost? A child never born? The possibilities were a chasm opening at her feet. Swallowing hard, Cora forced herself to look away, breaking the unnerving connection. She focused on the fire, its warmth suddenly insufficient against the chill of his scrutiny and the icy dread coiling in her stomach. Her mother's face, pale and pleading, superimposed itself over the flames, calling for her. The guilt was a leaden weight, heavier than her unborn child. She should be there. She needed to be there. Yet Silas's words from the night before echoed. You going back wouldn't cure your ma, it'd just feed his notion he owns everything. Brutal, but the image of Elijah, small and terrified on that treacherous trail in the fading light, gave them a terrible truth. Going back meant facing Jedediah's wrath, potentially endangering Elijah further, and achieving nothing but satisfying her father's twisted sense of order. The helplessness was suffocating. Silas finally moved. He didn't look at the cradle. He stood, the movement deliberate, and walked to the window, peering out at the pre-dawn grayness. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Cora busied herself with folding the bearskin, her movements stiff, avoiding the small wooden shape now permanently imprinted on her awareness. A sudden sharp crack echoed from outside, distant but powerful, like a giant tree snapping. It was followed by a low, rumbling groan that vibrated through the cabin floor. Cora froze, her breath catching. Silas stiffened, his gaze intensifying on the landscape. Another rumble, closer this time, shaking the shelves, causing tin cups to rattle. "Snow slide," Silas muttered, the word a low growl. He grabbed his heavy coat and hat. "Stay inside." He was out the door before Cora could react, the cold air rushing in like an unwelcome guest. Cora rushed to the window, pressing her face close to the cold, greased paper. The weak dawn light revealed a terrifying sight. A vast swathe of snow had broken loose high up on the slope opposite the cabin. It wasn't directly threatening them, but it had thundered down, carving a raw, white scar through the timberline and piling in a massive, chaotic heap directly over the path to the spring. The source of their water was buried under tons of ice and debris. Silas stood a dozen yards from the cabin, staring at the devastation, hands on his hips. Even from a distance, Cora could see the grim set of his shoulders. He turned, scanning the immediate area, then trudged back towards the cabin, his boots crunching heavily on the frozen crust. He pushed inside, bringing a blast of cold air. Snow dusted his beard and shoulders. He didn't speak immediately, shedding his outer layers near the door. The silence was heavier than before, laden with the new problem: water. The lifeblood of survival. Blocked. Springs buried, he stated flatly, moving to stoke the fire. Deep. Cora's hand instinctively went to her belly. What do we do?" The question felt small and desperate. Silas poked at the logs, sending sparks flying. "Snow," he gestured vaguely outside. "Plenty of it, but melting it takes fuel. Time." He glanced at the woodpile, already diminished from the long night of the wolf siege. It was a stark calculation. They had wood for warmth and cooking, but melting enough snow for 2 people, one heavily pregnant, for an indefinite period, it was a race they might lose. The weight of their isolation pressed down harder than ever. Pine Creek, with its wells and bustling life, felt like a dream. Here a single act of nature could tip the balance towards disaster. Cora remembered the long, thirsty summers on the farm, the desperate trips to the creek when the well ran low. Her father's voice, sharp with impatience. "Useless girl, spilling half of it. Think water grows on trees." The memory was a fresh sting. Silas didn't berate her. He moved with quiet purpose. He retrieved a large, blackened cooking pot and set it near the door. "Gonna need more wood," he said, pulling on his coat again. "Stay by the fire. Keep warm." He was gone for a long time. Cora listened to the sounds of axe blows echoing dully in the frozen air. Each strike felt like a countdown. She tried to busy herself, tidying the meager shelves, smoothing the furs on the cot, anything to avoid looking at the cradle or the pot waiting by the door. Her mind raced. How long? How long before the wood ran out? Before the cold seeped in? Before... She couldn't finish the thought, her hand resting protectively on her swollen middle. When Silas returned, his arms laden with split logs, his breath pluming in the cold cabin air, Cora was waiting. She dragged the heavy pot closer to the hearth. "I can help," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. With the snow, melting it. She met his gaze, a flicker of defiance battling the fear. She wouldn't be useless. Not this time. Silas paused, stacking the wood with methodical care. He looked at her, then at the pot, then back at her face. His expression was unreadable, but he didn't dismiss her. He gave a single curt nod. "Pot's heavy when full. Don't overfill. Spill hot water. Burn yourself." It wasn't encouragement. It was instruction, a grim acknowledgement of necessity. He showed her how to pack the snow tightly into the pot without spilling, how to position it carefully at the edge of the hearth where the heat was steady but not scorching. He demonstrated using a worn wooden spoon to stir the slush as it melted, preventing it from scorching to the bottom. "Waste not," he grunted, pointing to the spoon. Every drop, it was grueling, monotonous work. The pot seemed bottomless, swallowing scoop after scoop of snow, only to yield a disappointingly small amount of water. The heat from the fire was oppressive close up, making her sweat under her dress, while drafts from the door chilled her back. Her back ached, her feet swelled, but Cora kept at it, fueled by a desperate need to contribute, to prove she wasn't just a burden traded away by her father. Silas worked silently beside her, replenishing the snow supply outside, tending the fire, checking the barricades. He didn't praise her, but he didn't stop her either. His quiet acceptance of her labor felt like a different kind of acknowledgement. During a brief respite, Cora noticed something glinting faintly near the head of Silas's cot, partly tucked under the thin mattress. Not the daguerreotype, that was still on the shelf, facing the wall now. This was smaller, a tarnished silver locket on a broken chain. Her breath hitched. Another artifact, another piece of the puzzle that was Silas Thorne. She quickly looked away, her cheeks burning with the intrusion. She focused on stirring the slowly melting snow. Later, as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and grays, Cora sat near the hearth, exhaustion a deep ache in her bones. The water pot simmered, a small victory. Silas was meticulously cleaning his flintlock rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp in the close air. The rhythmic rasp of cloth on metal was oddly soothing. Her thoughts drifted to Elijah. Had he made it back safely? Was her mother still calling her name? The helplessness threatened to overwhelm her again. Acting on a desperate impulse, driven by a need to reach out, even symbolically, Cora fished a small folded piece of paper and a stub of pencil from the hidden pocket of her dress, remnants of a life before shame. She hesitated, glancing at Silas, his back turned as he worked on the rifle. "Dearest Ma," she began, the pencil trembling in her fingers. "Elijah came. He told me. My heart breaks." The words flowed, a torrent of love, guilt, and apology. She wrote of her fear, her baby, the harsh beauty and terrifying isolation of the mountains. She wrote of Silas, the gruff exterior, the unexpected tea, the hidden cradle, the terrifying competence against the wolves and the snowslide. "He is not what Pa said," she scrawled. "He is quiet. He keeps me alive." She didn't write her growing confused feelings of dependence, the fragile trust taking root in the frozen ground of her despair. She folded the letter small, writing Ma on the outside. Where to send it? How? It was a futile gesture, a message in a bottle tossed into an ocean of wilderness. But the act of writing it, of confessing to the paper, offered a sliver of release. She tucked the folded note deep into the same pocket, a secret talisman against the crushing isolation. Unseen by Cora, Silas's hand stilled on the rifle stock. He hadn't turned, but his posture had changed minutely, a subtle tightening of his shoulders. His gaze, fixed on the gleaming barrel, was distant, sharp. A tiny corner of the folded paper had caught in the rough fabric of her dress as she tucked it away, a pale triangle peeking out for just a second before disappearing. Long enough. He finished cleaning the rifle, the motions precise, deliberate. He placed it back beside the door. The cabin was quiet, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. Silas walked towards the hearth. He didn't look at Cora. Instead, he picked up the heavy iron poker and stirred the embers, sending a shower of sparks upwards like fleeing stars. Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the silence, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Writin' won't reach her, girl." He didn't turn. Words get lost in these mountains, like people. Cora's blood turned to ice. He'd seen, he knew, the fragile sense of privacy, the small act of defiance and connection, shattered. She stared at his broad back, her mouth dry, the unfinished cradle, and the hidden locket suddenly feeling like accusations in the firelight. What else did he see? What else did he know? The silence that followed his words was deeper, colder than the snowdrifts outside, heavy with the weight of her exposed secret, and the countless secrets he still guarded. The cabin, their fragile fortress, felt less like a shelter and more like a cage where every breath was watched, every thought laid bare. The question hung, thick and suffocating. What would he do? Silas's words hung in the frigid air like frozen breath. "Writin' won't reach her, girl. Words get lost in these mountains, like people." The accusation, though spoken low, felt like a shout in the sudden suffocating quiet. Cora stared at his broad back, her cheeks burning, the hidden letter a searing brand against her skin. He knew, he saw everything. The fragile sense of privacy she'd carved out with her pencil stub vanished. The cabin walls seemed to close in, the stacked firewood and the buffalo hide barrier feeling less like protection and more like the bars of a cell where Silas Thorne was the ever-watchful warden. What would he do? Report her defiance to an absent father? Dismiss her grief? Throw the crumpled note into the fire? He didn't turn. He just kept stirring the embers, the iron poker scraping rhythmically. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension and the weight of the snow-blocked spring. Cora's gaze flickered involuntarily towards his cot, where the edge of the locket had peeked out. Another secret, another ghost in this cabin filled with them. The unfinished cradle lay near her pallet, a silent question she dared not ask. Finally, Silas replaced the poker. He didn't look at her. He walked to the water pot, now nearly full from their arduous snow melting, and dipped a tin cup into it. He filled a second cup. Then, to Cora's utter astonishment, he walked towards her and held one out. Not tea this time, just hot water. Steam curled gently from the rim. His eyes, when they briefly met hers, held no anger, no reproach, just that same weary, guarded flatness. But the gesture, offering her water, the scarce vital resource, without a word, after catching her in a secret act, it was more confounding than any rage. "Drink," he grunted, the single word rough but not unkind. "Cold saps you, bad for—" He didn't finish, his gaze dropping pointedly to her swollen belly for a fraction of a second before shifting away. Cora took the cup, her fingers trembling. The heat seeped into her hands, a small, unexpected comfort. She sipped, the warm liquid a balm to her raw throat and frayed nerves. He hadn't punished her. He hadn't even mentioned the letter again. He'd given her water. The simple act, in the face of his discovery and their shared crisis, felt like a fragile truce. Perhaps he understood the desperate need to reach out, even futilely. Perhaps his words about lost people weren't just about her mother, but a reflection of his own buried pain. The fragile peace was shattered 3 days later. The relentless cold deepened, and the sky lowered, heavy and bruise-colored. The woodpile dwindled alarmingly despite Silas's constant forays into the skeletal, snow-laden pines. Melting snow consumed logs at an alarming rate. Cora's back ached constantly now, a deep grinding pressure that stole her breath. She moved slower, the simple act of tending the melting pot becoming a monumental effort. Fear for her baby was a constant companion, sharper than hunger, colder than the drafts seeping through the logs. Then the blizzard hit. It didn't announce itself, it simply arrived with the force of a collapsing mountain. One moment, the wind was its usual mournful howl. The next, the world outside vanished behind a swirling, blinding wall of white. Snow slammed against the cabin like thrown gravel. The timbers groaned under the assault. The fire, their lifeline, guttered and hissed as icy air forced its way through every crack and chink. Silas moved like a man possessed. He piled more logs onto the fire, building it into a roaring inferno that battled the invading cold. He dragged the heavy wooden chest back against the door, reinforcing it with sacks of grain. He stuffed rags into the worst cracks around the window frame. The cabin became a dim, smoky cave, the only light the frantic dance of the flames, the only sound the demonic shriek of the wind and the ominous creak of straining wood. Cora huddled on the bearskin, clutching her belly, terror a living thing inside her. The pressure intensified, becoming rhythmic, squeezing bands of pain radiating from her back. No, not now, not here, not in this. But the pain was insistent, undeniable. A low moan escaped her lips as another contraction seized her, stronger this time, stealing her breath. Silas froze, halfway through stuffing a rag into a crack. He turned slowly, his face etched with grim understanding in the flickering light. His gaze swept over her, taking in her hunched posture, her white-knuckled grip on her dress. The ice-blue eyes held no panic, only a fierce, focused intensity. "How long?" His voice was surprisingly calm, cutting through the storm's roar. I don't, since this morning, but stronger now," Cora gasped, tears of pain and terror mingling on her cheeks. "The storm, Silas, He didn't hesitate. He strode to the hearth, grabbed the largest cooking pot, and began filling it frantically with snow scooped from just inside the door. He shoved it onto the hottest part of the fire. "Need hot water, clean cloths." He scanned the cabin, his gaze landing on a folded piece of relatively clean burlap sack near his tools. He grabbed it, then rummaged in a trunk, pulling out an old soft wool shirt, worn thin but clean. He thrust them towards her. Tear. Make strips, now. The commands were sharp, urgent, but not unkind. Practical. Survival. He then moved to his cot. Cora, fighting through another wave of pain, watched through blurred vision. He didn't look at the daguerreotype. He reached under the thin mattress and pulled out the tarnished silver locket she'd glimpsed. For a moment, he held it, his thumb rubbing over its surface, his face a mask of anguish so profound it made Cora's own pain momentarily recede. Then, with a swift, decisive movement, he snapped the broken chain free. He walked back to the hearth, picked up a pair of iron tongs, and held the locket in the very heart of the roaring flames. "Sterilizin'," he muttered, though she hadn't asked. His voice was thick. He held it there for a long minute, the silver glowing red-hot, before plunging it into the snowmelt water now heating in the smaller pot. A violent hiss erupted. He pulled it out, the chain discarded, the locket now a dull, clean gray. He placed it carefully on the edge of the table. "For the cord," he stated, his voice rough again, the moment of vulnerability sealed away. Clean cut. The revelation slammed into Cora with the force of the storm. He knew what to do. He'd done this before. The locket wasn't just a trinket, it was a tool, imbued with a terrible history. The woman, the child, they hadn't just been lost to the mountains, they had been here, with him. This cabin had known life and death long before Cora arrived. There was no time for questions. The storm raged, the contractions came faster, harder, tearing through her. Time lost meaning in the smoky, fire-lit chaos. Silas was everywhere, stoking the fire, boiling water, handing her torn strips of cloth, his movements economical, precise. He didn't offer soothing words, his presence was his anchor. When the pain became unbearable, a guttural cry tearing from her throat, he was there, a solid, silent pillar beside her pallet. He guided her breathing with curt, simple instructions. Breathe, deep, push, his voice a steady rumble beneath the wind's shriek. He used the cooled locket, its edge sharp and sterile, when the time came. And then, amidst the elemental fury outside and the primal struggle within, a new sound pierced the cacophony, a thin, indignant wail. Cora collapsed back onto the furs, drenched in sweat and tears, trembling violently. Silas, his large hands impossibly gentle, cradled a tiny squirming bundle wrapped in the soft wool shirt. He placed the baby, a girl, impossibly small, miraculously alive, onto Cora's heaving chest. The world narrowed to the weight and warmth of her daughter, the fierce instinctive love that flooded her, washing away the pain, the fear, the shame. She traced a finger over the tiny wrinkled face, so perfect, so vulnerable. A sob escaped her, this time of pure, overwhelming wonder. Silas stood back, wiping his hands on a clean cloth, his face unreadable in the dim light. He looked from mother and child to the roaring fire battling the storm, then to the locket, cooling on the table. His gaze lingered there, a lifetime of sorrow etched in the lines around his eyes. He didn't speak, he simply moved to the pile of wood near the wall. He picked up the unfinished cradle, he sat on his stool, pulled out his knife, and began to carve. Not roughly, not hastily, but with a focused, deliberate care, smoothing the curve of the remaining rocker. The rhythmic shick-shick of the blade on wood joined the storm's dying howl, and the baby's soft mewling. Cora watched him, exhaustion warring with profound gratitude. He hadn't just kept her alive, he'd brought her daughter into the world. He'd used the relic of his own lost family to safeguard hers. The gruff mountain man traded a problem, had become the unlikely midwife to her future. The storm began to abate near dawn. The wind's fury lessened to a sigh. The relentless assault of snow against the cabin softened. Gray light, weak but undeniable, filtered through the cracks around the window. Cora lay propped on the bearskin. Her daughter, Elara, she'd decided silently, a name meaning light, a defiance against the darkness, sleeping peacefully against her breast, swaddled in the soft wool. Silas sat by the hearth, the cradle finished now, resting on the floor beside him. It was simple, sturdy, the pale pine sanded smooth. He stared into the embers, the locket held loosely in his large, calloused hand. The lines of his face seemed deeper in the dawn light, etched with a weariness that went beyond the night's ordeal. Cora spoke softly, her voice raspy but clear. "Silas." He didn't turn, but his shoulders tensed minutely. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had, for her, For everything. He was silent for a long moment. Then, his voice a low rumble, he spoke, not looking at her but at the locket in his palm. Her name was Anna, the babe, Elijah. He closed his fist tightly around the silver, his knuckles white. Fever, winter, too far from help. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. The stark words painted a picture of loss as vast and cold as the mountains outside. The why of his isolation, the source of the pain that lived in those ice-blue eyes, laid bare in 3 terrible sentences. He stood abruptly, the movement startling in the quiet. He walked to the table, placed the locket down beside the cold mug of chamomile tea from another lifetime. Then he picked up the finished cradle. He carried it not to Cora, but placed it carefully, silently, near the foot of his own cot. A space made. Not an embrace, not a declaration, but an acknowledgement. A small carved vessel of hope placed within the fortress of his solitude. He moved to the door, lifted the bar, and pushed it open. The world outside was transformed, buried under a pristine, silent blanket of snow, the rising sun painting the peaks in hues of rose and gold. The air was knife-sharp, clean, scoured by the storm. Silas stood in the doorway, a broad silhouette against the blinding white and the vast indifferent beauty of the bitterroots, breathing in the dawn. Cora held Ilara closer, watching him. She wouldn't be returning to Pine Creek, to her father's judgment or her mother's fading call. Her place was here, in this harsh, beautiful wilderness, with this broken, resilient man who had carved a cradle in the heart of a blizzard. The path ahead was uncharted, fraught with hardship, but for the first time since Tommy Briggs's vanishing smile, Cora Hale felt not shame, but a fierce, quiet certainty. She had survived, her daughter lived, and in the silent language of shared survival and a small pinewood cradle, a new family, forged in ice and hope, had taken root against the mountain. The dawn light spilling across the cabin floor touched the smooth curve of the cradle rocker, glinting like a promise held in the palm of the wild.